the same airplane, 2 years apart. In 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was probably the best single-seat fighter on Earth for the war it was designed to fight. By 1943, young Japanese pilots were climbing into that same cockpit and dying in it at rates that should have ended the program. Nothing about the airframe changed enough to explain the difference. Everything around it did. That gap between 1941 and 1943 is one of the strangest reversals in military aviation. Not because the Zero got worse exactly, but because the world caught up to it, overtook it, and then lapped it, while Japan had no second act ready. The fighter that once owned the sky over half the Pacific became, for most of the men flying it, a metal coffin with a propeller bolted to the front. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to 1937 to a set of requirements written by the Imperial Japanese Navy. They wanted a carrier-based fighter that could escort bombers across enormous Pacific distances, outclimb and outmaneuver anything it met, and still land on a ship at the end of the mission. Those are 3 very demanding things to ask of one airplane, and the IJN wanted all of them simultaneously, with no compromise on any of them. What they were really asking for was a machine that could do work that normally required 2 or 3 different aircraft, and they wanted it to weigh less than any of them. The man who had to solve that problem was Jiro Horikoshi, working at Mitsubishi. The constraint he faced was harsh. Japanese aero engines in the late 1930s produced meaningfully less power than their Western equivalents. If you wanted range and agility from a less powerful engine, you had to cut weight everywhere else. Not a little bit, aggressively across every system and structural element. Horikoshi stripped the airplane down to the absolute minimum structure that could hold together in flight and in carrier landings. The A6M1 prototype flew for the first time on April 1, 1939, and by 1940 it was in service, seeing combat over China later that year. The weight savings were not subtle. Horikoshi used a light alloy called extra super duralumin for much of the structure. The wingskins were thin enough to flex visibly under load. The wings were built integral to the fuselage for stiffness, but everything else about the construction prioritized lightness over strength. The entire airframe was optimized around a modest Nakajima Sakai radial engine producing roughly 940 to 1,130 horsepower depending on the variant and the altitude. To get the weight down far enough, Horikoshi left out pilot armor behind the seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy structural bracing for high-speed dives. None of these omissions were accidents. They were engineering decisions driven by doctrine. The IJN had fought in China against weak, poorly equipped opposition and drawn the conclusion that agility and range mattered more than keeping the pilot alive when something went wrong. Attack capability mattered more than damage absorption. Strike hard, turn fast, fly far. Everything else was dead weight. That conclusion was not as reckless as it sounds in hindsight. Western air forces had only recently accepted the weight penalty of armor and self-sealing tanks themselves, and they did it grudgingly after the brutal lessons of the Battle of Britain forced the issue. Self-sealing tanks required layers of rubber an inch or thicker wrapped around the fuel cells, rubber that swelled shut when punctured by bullets. That protection cut internal fuel capacity and added weight that had to come from somewhere, usually range or climb rate. Japan looked at that trade-off, looked at the limited power available from their engines, and said no. They chose distance over durability. In 1940, against the opposition they expected to face, that math worked. The numbers in the early A6M2 Model 21 still hold up as impressive. Top speed around 330 to 340 miles per hour at medium altitude. Service ceiling somewhere between 32,000 and 38,000 feet, depending on the source and test conditions. And then the range figure that made planners across the Pacific stop and reread, roughly 1,500 to 1,900 miles, with a drop tank. For a single-engine carrier fighter in 1940, that number was considered nearly impossible. No Allied planner expected a ship-based fighter to show up over targets at those distances from the nearest carrier deck. The Zero's wing loading sat around 22 pounds per square foot, giving it a turn radius that made every Allied fighter look clumsy by comparison. It carried two 20mm Type 99 cannon in the wings and two 7.7mm machine guns in the upper fuselage, plus the ability to carry small bombs. It was a complete offensive package, beautifully designed, as long as nobody shot back with any accuracy. Over China in 1940, the Zero tore through everything it met. The opposition consisted of obsolete or poorly flown aircraft, and the results were lopsided enough to create a legend. Intelligence reports circulated claiming a 12-to-1 kill ratio, 12 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. Historians debate the exact figures, but the precise ratio matters less than what Allied pilots believed heading into 1941. They believed they were facing something close to Invincible. That belief, carried into cockpits across the Pacific, shaped morale, shaped tactics, and produced caution in some pilots and paralysis in others. It cost lives for months before the reality became clearer. Then came December 1941, and the months that followed were a sustained nightmare for Allied air forces across half the globe. At Pearl Harbor, dozens of Zeros escorted the bomber waves, strafed airfields where rows of American aircraft sat wing to wing in the open, and provided air cover over the harbor while the torpedo planes and dive bombers did their work below. The IJN had roughly 500 or more Zeros in service at the outbreak of war, with about 300 in first-line operational units. American museum accounts note that Zeros were the main Japanese fighter during the attack on Hawaii, and that early Allied fighters like the P-40 and P-35 were at a disadvantage in a dogfight against a Zero flown by a skilled pilot. Over the next several months, Zeros accompanied Japanese advances through the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and into the Indian Ocean. In April 1942, during a Japanese naval raid on Ceylon, one frequently cited engagement saw 36 Zeros reportedly shoot down 27 British aircraft for the loss of a single Zero. That kind of exchange ratio goes beyond ordinary military advantage and enters the territory of psychological warfare. Allied pilots were not just being outfought, they were being rattled at a level that affected doctrine and training decisions for months. British and American pilots who survived those early encounters were shocked by two things above all else. The agility of the Zero, which let it turn inside Hurricanes, P-40S, and even Spitfires at low speed, made the standard European-style turning dogfights suicidal for anyone who tried it. And the range, which meant Zeros appeared over targets far beyond what any Western doctrine considered possible for ship-based fighters, creating the impression of an airplane that could be everywhere and could not be escaped. RAF and USAAF training had been built around dogfighting German and Italian aircraft in European conditions. Claire Chenot, who had been working with fighter pilots in China before the American entry into the war, later described the mismatch bluntly. Methods that worked well against German and Italian equipment were suicide against the acrobatic Japanese fighters. But here is the part that gets lost in most retellings of the early Zero legend. The airplane was only half the story, the other half was the men inside it, and in 1941 those men were extraordinary by any standard of comparison. At Pearl Harbor, no IJN pilot had fewer than 600 flying hours in his logbook. Many senior pilots and formation leaders carried 1,500 hours or more. Japanese naval pilot training was extremely selective. A short and brutal pipeline that washed out enormous numbers of candidates to produce a tiny elite cadre. In some pre-war years, the selection process was so strict that fewer than 100 pilot candidates were accepted. These were not assembly line pilots filling slots. They were combat veterans of the China campaign with real experience killing other airplanes, using sophisticated coordinated tactics, including their own versions of diving attacks, and possessing excellent situational awareness developed through years of operational flying and hard selection pressure. Their Allied opponents in the Pacific during those first months were still adjusting to the heat, the distances, the unfamiliar geography, and the basic problem of fighting a type of airplane they had never trained against. That triple combination is what actually produced the aura of invincibility, the airplane performing within its design envelope, flown by world-class pilots, against completely unprepared enemies using the wrong tactics. All three conditions had to hold at the same time for the legend to work. Remove any one of them, and the picture changes. By 1943, all three were gone. The seeds of the Zero's collapse were in the airframe from the first rivet. Even in 1941, it carried vulnerabilities that became lethal the moment any one of those three favorable conditions slipped. No cockpit armor meant that a burst from a .50 caliber machine gun, or even a few solid hits from rifle caliber guns, could wound or kill the pilot outright. No self-sealing fuel tanks meant those same hits could ignite fuel and turn the airplane into a fireball in seconds. Allied fighters were progressively adopting armor plate behind the seat and self-sealing tanks using thick layered rubber that drastically reduced fire risk. The weight penalty was real, cutting into range and climb. The survival improvement was also real. Allied pilots could take hits and limp home. Zero pilots, overwhelmingly, could not. In June 1942, a Zero crash-landed almost intact on Akutan Island in the Aleutians. It belonged to Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, who was killed in the landing. U.S. forces recovered the airplane the following month, repaired it, and flew it in a systematic test program at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. What the testing revealed confirmed suspicions that combat reports had only hinted at, and it quantified the weaknesses in cold, specific terms. The fuel tanks could be punctured with a screwdriver, not a bullet, not a cannon shell, a hand tool. The engine cut out under negative G-forces, which meant any violent pushover or bunt maneuver could leave the pilot with a dead propeller at exactly the worst possible moment in a fight. And the ailerons, the roll control surfaces on the wings, stiffened badly at higher speeds. Above about 200 knots indicated airspeed, rolling to the right became sluggish. At high dive speeds, the Zero lost so much roll authority that it became clumsy, predictable, and easy to trap. A fast-diving attacker could set up behind it, overshoot deliberately, pull up, and come back around before the Zero could roll away to escape. That high-speed weakness is the one that mattered most because the new generation of American fighters was being designed and flown at exactly those higher speeds. Engine power and dive performance counted for more in the emerging style of combat than raw, low-speed turning ability. The Zero was superbly optimized for a fight that its enemies were systematically refusing to show up for. Every time an Allied pilot dove through, fired, and climbed away without turning, the Zero's greatest advantage sat there unused. The Zero also had nowhere to grow. It was tightly optimized around the Sakai engine's modest power. When Japan tried to add armor and fuel protection in later variants like the A6M3 and A6M5, weight went up by roughly 25 to 30%, while engine power increased only about 15 to 20%. The result, later Zeros were slower and less maneuverable than the original A6M2, and they were still far more fragile than anything the Allies were flying. You could not add the missing protection without destroying the agility and range that made the airplane competitive. Japan lacked the engine technology to carry both. Western powers were already building 2,000 horsepower radials. Japan was stuck around 1,100. The Akutan Zero story gets told a lot as the moment everything changed, the captured airplane that cracked the code. Japanese historian Masatake Okumiya later called it a prize almost beyond value and compared its strategic impact to the defeat at Midway. The test data confirmed performance curves, quantified the aileron stiffness problem, and gave engineers hard numbers to work with. That mattered. But historian John Lundstrom and others make a strong case that the tactics to beat the Zero were already being developed and used in combat before anyone examined the Akutan wreck. Claire Chennault had taught his P-40 pilots to avoid turning fights, use dives and high-speed slashing attacks, and exploit the American fighter's toughness and superior dive speed. He was doing this before Pearl Harbor, based on observation, not captured hardware. The U.S. Navy was building its own counter-doctrine through early 1942 as combat reports accumulated from the Coral Sea and other engagements. Pilots were learning to enter the fight with altitude and energy advantage, make one fast pass, and then climb or dive away without turning. The Akutan data validated and refined a playbook that was already being written in blood. It was part of a broader learning curve, not a single revelatory moment. John Thatch had developed his famous weave formation in 1941 as a specific counter to the Zero threat. Two fighters flew roughly parallel, then turned toward each other repeatedly, crossing flight paths. A Zero chasing one Wildcat would fly straight through the gun sight of the other as they wove back and forth. Mutual support turned the Zero's pursuit into a trap. At Midway in June 1942, Thatch used the tactic against numerically superior Zeros and proved they could be beaten with coordination and discipline, even in a slower, less nimble airplane like the Wildcat. The carrier battles of 1942 started the bleeding in earnest. From Coral Sea in May through Midway in June, Eastern Solomons in August, and Santa Cruz in October, the IJN lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway and large numbers of experienced pilots across all 4 engagements. Before Midway, Japanese carrier air groups had suffered surprisingly low pilot losses, despite massive territorial gains across the Western Pacific. The system was working: fast offensives, overwhelmed defenders, quick victories, and limited attrition among the attackers. Midway ended that in a single afternoon. 4 carriers burned and sank, taking their aircraft and many of their air crews with them. A large portion of the elite Naval Aviator Corps died in a compressed period, and the Japanese replacement training system was nowhere near ready to absorb that kind of shock. The men lost at Midway had taken a decade to train. They could not be replaced in months. Then came Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal broke Japanese naval aviation as a competitive fighting force. The air campaign over Guadalcanal from August 1942 through early 1943 was the most destructive sustained attritional fight the IJN's air arm ever experienced. Including 2 carrier battles fought during the campaign, IJN aircraft losses in and around Guadalcanal approached 700 airplanes. American losses across Navy, Marine, and Army air units combined ran about 420 aviators. Fewer in raw count, and devastatingly fewer in proportion to total training and production capacity. Japanese losses hit hardest among the most experienced pilots, the pre-war trained veterans who could make the Zero lethal. On the fighter-to-fighter ledger for August 7th through November 15th, 1942, Zero losses of approximately 106 slightly exceeded combined Wildcat losses of 70 plus P-39 and P-400 losses of 13. The Invincible Zero was already losing more airframes than the stubby, underpowered Wildcat. Retired U.S. Navy Captain Mark Liebman, working from American Records, argues the Wildcat-Zero exchange was roughly even early in the war, maybe slightly favoring the Wildcat. By February 1943, at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Wildcats were claiming about 5.9 Zeros for each Wildcat lost. Overclaiming was real on both sides, and Japanese record gaps make exact ratios contentious. The trend is unmistakable, regardless of the precise numbers, and the trend is what matters here. Several things converged on Guadalcanal to shift the balance against the Zero permanently. American forces on the island had radar and a chain of coast watchers stretching across the Solomon Islands that provided early warning of incoming Japanese raids. That warning bought time to scramble fighters and climb to altitude before contact. At higher altitudes and faster approach speeds, the Zero's advantages shrank while its control stiffness and poor high-speed handling became liabilities that American pilots could exploit. Geography played a quiet, vicious role in the attrition math. Most air battles happened over or near Guadalcanal itself. Downed American pilots stood a reasonable chance of rescue and return to duty. Marine and Navy pilots, who ditched near Henderson Field or in the surrounding waters, could be picked up by PT boats, destroyers, or even coast watchers on nearby islands within hours. Japanese pilots shot down over the 600 miles of open ocean between Rabaul and Guadalcanal faced terrible survival and rescue odds. The distances were too great, the seas too rough, and the rescue infrastructure simply did not exist at the scale required. Each Japanese loss drained an elite pool that was already running low, and every American pilot recovered was a veteran who went back into the fight with experience that made him harder to kill next time. The U.S. Navy was also building an institutional learning system that had no Japanese equivalent. Fleet replacement squadrons trained pilots in specific aircraft and current tactics before they reached the front. Lessons from Guadalcanal were captured, standardized into doctrine, and distributed through the training pipeline so that fresh pilots arrived already knowing things that veterans had learned the hard way. Japan had nothing comparable. Their system was designed for peacetime excellence, not wartime scale. Japan's pilot training pipeline cracked under the pressure of sustained losses. Pre-war training gave candidates around 100 to 160 flying hours in primary and intermediate phases before operational conversion, with many accumulating several hundred more hours in fleet service before seeing combat. That produced phenomenal pilots in tiny numbers with almost no reserves for a long war. As replacement demands surged after Midway and Guadalcanal, the IJN shortened courses, admitted less qualified candidates, and assigned undertrained pilots directly to combat units. By 1943, the average Zero pilot had dramatically fewer hours than his 1941 predecessor, less tactical instruction, and often no combat experience whatsoever. Washout standards relaxed. NCOs led formations because officers had been killed faster than they could be replaced. By January 1945, average training hours for new IJN pilots had dropped to around 275 hours, and Army pilot training numbers were even worse. The American approach was the opposite in almost every respect. U.S. pilot training expanded enormously through 1943 and 1944. Pilots arrived in theater sometimes with fewer combat-relevant hours than early IJN elites, but they arrived in overwhelming numbers, and the support architecture around them improved constantly. Training syllabi were updated based on combat reports from the front. New pilots learned current enemy tactics before they ever left the continental United States. Gunnery training improved. Formation flying drilled the mutual support principles that made boom and zoom tactics work in practice. The United States routinely pulled combat veterans home to train the next generation, seeding their hard-won knowledge through the entire pipeline. Japan adopted almost no pilot rotation. Experienced Japanese pilots stayed at the front until they died, or became physically unable to fly. Every American rotation cycle compounded institutional knowledge across the entire force. Every Japanese combat loss erased knowledge that existed only in one man's head. By mid-1943, Japanese naval air units had a recognizable structure, a shrinking core of surviving veterans who could still make the Zero lethal, surrounded by a growing number of undertrained newcomers flying the same fragile airframe against numerically superior, technically superior Allied formations. For those new pilots, the Zero was a death trap, an outdated, unprotected airplane where one or two hits from a .50 caliber gun meant fire, and fire in that cockpit at that altitude with no armor and no self-sealing fuel system almost always meant death. Then the new American fighters arrived and turned a losing situation into an unrecoverable one. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was designed from the ground up as a Zero killer. It shared the rugged Grumman construction philosophy with the Wildcat, but sat around a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine producing about 2,000 to 2,200 horsepower, roughly double what the Zero had. The Hellcat was faster at every altitude and outclimbed the Zero above about 10,000 feet. It could sustain high-speed dives and high G loads without structural failure, something the Zero's lightweight construction could not match. It entered combat in late August 1943 in raids against Marcus Island. The protection gap between the two airplanes was extreme. The Hellcat carried 212 pounds of armor around the cockpit and engine, plus self-sealing fuel tanks. 6.50 caliber machine guns with generous ammunition loads gave it consistent long-range firepower against which the Zero's low-velocity 20mm cannon with its limited ammunition supply was outmatched at any distance beyond close range. Across the war, Hellcats were credited with 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed, roughly 75% of all U.S. Navy and Marine fighter air-to-air victories in the Pacific. Official Navy figures list a 19-to-1 air-to-air kill ratio for the Hellcat. That covers fighter versus fighter engagements only. Including accidents and anti-aircraft losses brings the overall number down, and some researchers flag this distinction to temper the mythology. The core fact remains unchallenged. The Hellcat dominated Japanese fighters in air combat to a degree that was without precedent in the Pacific theater. Hellcat pilots could afford to make mistakes. They could take hits, absorb damage, experiment with tactics, and still fly home to learn from the experience. The airplane's armor and self-sealing tanks turned survivable what would have been fatal in any Japanese fighter. A Hellcat pilot who misjudged an approach, got too slow, or let a Zero get a deflection shot still had a fighting chance of walking away. That forgiveness changed the learning dynamic of the air war. Pilots who survived mistakes became better pilots. Zero pilots who made the same errors became casualties. The asymmetry in survivability meant that the American collective learning curve accelerated with every engagement, while Japan's collective skill level eroded at the same rate. One force was getting smarter every week. The other was getting younger and less experienced. The Vought F-4 U Corsair entered combat in February 1943 with its first air engagement recorded on February 14th. Early operations exposed problems with forward visibility and carrier landing behavior that initially steered the Navy toward land-based Marine Corps use. By mid to late 1943, the Corsair became one of the most feared fighters in the Pacific. Across the war, Corsairs claimed about 2,140 air-to-air victories for 189 losses, an overall ratio of roughly 11-to-1. A focused study of Corsair versus Zero encounters specifically in the Solomons and around Rabaul during 1943 and 1944 suggests a more modest ratio, closer to 1-to-1 when isolating those particular duels. The huge aggregate Corsair numbers came partly from later periods when Japanese pilot quality had collapsed, and partly from combat against all Japanese types, not just Zeros. Ace Ken Walsh observed that the Corsair outperformed the Zero in every respect except low-speed turn and low-speed climb. The tactical doctrine followed naturally. Stay fast, stay high, dictate the engagement from above, and never allow a Zero to drag you into its preferred speed envelope. A Corsair pilot who followed that discipline was fighting from a position of massive advantage. A Corsair pilot who forgot it, who got slow and tried to turn, could still die because the Zero in competent hands retained a narrow low-speed window where it was dangerous right up to the end. The P-38 Lightning added another layer of threat in the Southwest Pacific with its twin engines, high speed, excellent climb rate, long range, and concentrated nose armament of a 20mm cannon plus 4.50 caliber guns. P-47ES and improved P-51ES appeared in Pacific roles as the war progressed. The story repeated with every new arrival. Every new Allied fighter was faster, tougher, and better armed, and every pilot flying one had been trained in energy management tactics designed to exploit every weakness the Zero carried. Pull back to 1943 and consider what a freshly trained Japanese pilot actually faced when he strapped into a Zero for combat. He is sitting in a fragile, flammable airplane with thin alloy skins, no armor behind his seat, and fuel tanks that testing showed could be punctured with a screwdriver. His ailerons stiffen above 200 knots, making him clumsy at exactly the speeds his opponents prefer to fight. His engine produces half the horsepower of the fighters across the line. He carries limited cannon ammunition, maybe 100 rounds total for the two 20mm guns, and has received limited tactical training compared to the veterans who flew this same type 2 years earlier. His opponents have radar warning, coast watcher networks, ground-controlled interception, vectoring them into position before he even knows they are there, and team tactics designed around every specific weakness his airplane carries. If he takes a burst from those 6.50 caliber guns, he probably catches fire. If he goes down over water far from base, rescue is unlikely. The men facing him are flying armored, self-sealing, massively overpowered machines that can absorb punishment, outclimb him, outdive him, and disengage whenever they choose. They fight in pairs that cover each other. They refuse to turn with him. They come from above and behind, fire a short burst, and are gone before he can react. Japan tried to fix it. Later, Zero variants introduced some armor and limited fuel tank improvements in the A6M3 and A6M5 models. But without a major engine upgrade that Japan's industrial base could not provide, the heavier airframes simply lost the low-speed agility that had been the Zero's last remaining advantage, while gaining survivability that was still nowhere near Allied standards. A post-war technical analysis stated the bind directly. The Zero's design offered no reserve for improvement, and attempts to add protection slowed an already marginal fighter. Make it heavier, it gets slower and clumsier. Keep it light, pilots keep burning. There was no engineering solution available to Japan within the constraints of their engine technology and industrial capacity. By 1944 and 1945, the Zero's declining combat value showed up in its assigned roles. It was increasingly used for kamikaze attacks, where speed, protection, and pilot survival were beside the point. The airplane had become a makeshift missile. Not because Japan preferred that role, but because conventional air combat against Hellcats and Corsairs was no longer a viable option for most of the pilots Japan could field. The math was blunt. Sending an undertrained pilot in an unarmored fighter against a formation of Hellcats resulted in dead Japanese pilots and undamaged American ones. Sending the same pilot on a one-way dive into a ship at least had a chance of causing damage. Allied commentators and even some Japanese officers described the Zero as virtually useless in the conventional fighter role by that stage of the war. The most feared fighter in the Pacific had been reduced to ordnance. One thing should be said plainly, because fairness to the airplane and the men who flew it well demands it. In the hands of surviving aces like Saburo Sakai and other pre-war veterans who had somehow lived through 1942 and into 1943, the Zero remained a genuinely dangerous weapon throughout the entire war. A well-handled Zero at the right speed and altitude, with a pilot who understood exactly where his margins were, who knew when to engage and when to run, could still kill experienced Allied pilots who got overconfident or careless. Individual combat accounts confirm this into 1944 and even 1945. The airplane still had teeth in the right hands, but the average 1943 Zero pilot was not Saburo Sakai. He was a young man with a fraction of the training, strapped into the same unforgiving machine, facing enemies who knew precisely how to kill him and had every tool required to do it efficiently. The Zero's rise and fall tracks something larger than one airplane's service record. The same basic airframe flew from 1940 to 1945. A design philosophy built for a short, sharp war of maneuver collided with a long industrial war of attrition it was never intended to survive. A training system that produced masters could not replace them once the killing started in earnest. An industrial base that could not build the next generation of high-power engines left designers trapped inside an airframe they had already optimized past its limits. On the other side of the line, an enemy learned fast, produced at enormous scale, and fed every lesson back through its institutions, so that knowledge compounded across the entire force instead of dying with the individual men who earned it. The cost of all those failures landed on the pilots, the ones who climbed into a cockpit that gave them almost no margin for error against opponents who had margin to spare.